All right, welcome to the Latest.com show. I'm Igor Dares. Joining us, he's a military vet and Latest.com senior political and hat analyst from Pittsburgh, Josh Patton. And he's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. State Department and the author of We Meant Well from New York, Peter Van Buren. Yesterday we all woke up to another terrorist attack in Europe, this time in Brussels. The terrorists hit the city's airport and metro. More than 30 people were killed. About 270 were injured. And here at home, before the dust even settled, conservatives were responding in the way they tend to do, advocating for torture, advocating for patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, and, of course, slamming Obama. Peter, what was your first impression of the bombings in Belgium that we saw, given that it's only about 4 or 5 months since the Paris attacks and that immediate knee-jerk reaction from the conservative politicians here at home?
Well, you have to moderate my remarks at this point, because everyone will say, "Oh my God, too soon. Today we are all Belgians," and put up a Facebook post. But once again, I have to shake my head and say we've been pursuing a particular strategy against terrorists for 15 years, and it doesn't. I mean, there is extraordinary empirical evidence, unfortunately, including the loss of 30-some lives yesterday in Belgium, that it just is not working. And unless and until that strategy is realigned, then it's very sad to say that people will continue to lose their lives in this particular way. Needless to say, torture and carpet bombing are not included in the plan to rethink the strategy.
Or international law. Well, Josh, on the one hand, you had Trump come out and advocate closing the border, advocate torturing the terrorists that they have in custody in Europe. And on the other hand, you had Obama, who spent maybe a minute of his speech in Cuba discussing the attack and then went to a baseball game. Is that really the best way to react to this kind of event when you have people who, whether, they should be or not, are increasingly worried about terror attacks here?
Well, before we get into picking apart the individual partisan reactions, I do think that the overall reaction in general to the Brussels bombing has continued what I think is a disturbing trend of late, and that is these events happen, and whether it's because of the instant nature of the internet and the desire to always have a hot take, it seems like we don't take time to just, react to things as people rather than reacting to things, as a conservative candidate for president or as the president of the United States or as members of the press. Justice Scalia's death was politicized seconds after it was announced, minutes maybe. Before I even had heard the news, Trump had been on 2 different networks talking about closing the borders and, advocating, saying that we have a problem with Muslims and things like that. And that's just disgusting. Now, with President Obama, I can kind of understand how on the first presidential trip to Cuba, skipping the baseball game, I understand sort of why maybe they didn't change their plans. And I thought Obama had a good answer in saying that, when you let terrorism disrupt your lives, the terrorists end up winning. And I think that's an important thing we don't talk about enough. But I also feel like his response did sort of seem like he didn't give a shit, which is also the wrong message to send, especially considering that, for better or worse, America sort of owns this current problem we have with terrorism.
Well, there's another part to Obama's reaction, and that is that there were American casualties in this. I'm not sure if they've confirmed any deaths, but certainly some Americans were injured in it. Yeah. And, Obama's reaction of, we can't let terrorists control our lives is something that I strongly agree with him. Absolutely. But at the same time, he plays a symbolic role in the United States, and to be, the shots that we saw on the internet, him on one side of the screen doing the wave, and then, people being pulled out of the rubble on the other side of the screen. He probably should have taken some time off to grieve, to monitor the situation, to make phone calls to the relatives, call it what you want. But going back to Josh's comment about not politicizing it, I think this would have been an opportunity for him to humanize the reaction by saying, even though we don't let the terrorists control our lives, we do grieve for those who have been injured, and in my role as president, particularly the Americans, and get out of the goddamn baseball stadium. It just didn't look good.
Well, one other thing that's happening, there were obviously terrorist attacks in Europe, where you had the London bombing, you had the Madrid bombing, but just in the past year, in this one area in France and Belgium, you have the Brussels attack, you had the Paris attack just a few months ago, and you also have the Charlie Hebdo attack. Josh, should we be more worried about terrorist attacks occurring more frequently here?
I don't know. I mean, it's obviously that's always the goal. And I do think there might be a question, a legitimate question to be asked in if the recent success of ISIS in achieving these sort of attacks, especially in Europe, arguably the San Bernardino shooters as well, what role that plays with how intelligence apparatus has changed, given the revelations of Edward Snowden and the reforms, cosmetic though they, were accused of being, to that apparatus in Congress. So I'm curious about that, and I do think that we're concerned, I think, about how Americans feel about this, and part of it is this terrible narcissism. If you noticed, I don't know, but I noticed on social media yesterday, a lot of people talking about these terrorist attacks in Brussels, Belgium, were not talking about Europe or Belgium or anything like that. They were talking about it like it was an attack here on America, and that America is the main goal, the main target of the so-called Islamic State. And that just strikes me as nonsense and sort of galling in a way, because, could you imagine if in the aftermath of 9/11, if the Brits had said, the real thing we have to be careful about is the terror, like that would have we would have been really insulted and sort of, I don't know, it just would have added insult to injury. And I feel like that's what a lot of is this sort of conversation is doing now. That said, I do think that, the efforts with which we talk about fighting terrorism, and I'm sure we're going to get to the various plans that have been released later in the show, but, the strategies all sound the same. None of that effective. And I don't feel with the government about what the threats actually are. And what's being done to sort of degrade the terrorist organizations and protect Americans at home. I definitely think that it's going to be something that will come up throughout the campaign. The question is if the conversation we end up having, if it's about ridiculous things like, fictional Muslim coalitions that don't exist, or, unconstitutional bans on travel to the United States, that's not the conversation that we need to be having. That might be the conversation we get, but the conversation we need to have is sort of a frank one about, all the problems of terrorism, to include any sort of ways that Western culture facilitates the success these militants have in recruiting people who feel criticized in their own neighborhoods and things like that. We need to start ideas.
You were breaking up hard there. But one thing that I think
it was so profound. I nailed the whole thing.
One thing that I think is lost in the whole political and social media discussion about the greater threat of terrorism is specific instances in which they happen. Like with the Brussels attack yesterday, the government and the police in Brussels have really shit the bed, and on a global scale now, because Belgium for years now has had more fighters leave to Syria to join ISIS than any European country per capita. It's shocking numbers, and the government seemingly has done very little in response. One of the brothers in the suicide attack yesterday was actually captured and then released just months ago because Belgium couldn't connect them to any kind of terror links. We saw just last week when they arrested the remaining Paris attacker. It took them over 4 months to find him, even though he was in the same neighborhood where he lived, where all these guys lived, in Molenbeek. And, yeah, he was right there. We fear terrorism, but, Peter, isn't the real problem, and the reason these attacks are happening in this part of Europe in particular, is the threat of government and police incompetence when we're dealing with these situations?
Well, if you take the word terrorism off the table and just talk about the acts as acts of violence, let's just use that. That's a neutral enough word. The Newtown Sandy Hook shootings a couple of years ago in the United States took about as many lives as were lost in Belgium yesterday. And the lives were children, and they were all Americans. You really have to find, I'm sure if you went out on the street and asked Americans today whether more people died at Sandy Hook or in Belgium, they'd all say Belgium. These are acts of violence. They occur on a rational scale very infrequently. You're talking about a couple of attacks, two attacks in Paris in a year, one in Belgium in a year. Here in the United States, we've had in 220 years basically one catastrophic, horrific day. And since then, not a lot. We've all seen the statistics. Your chances of getting hit by lightning are greater than being a victim of terrorism inside the United States. So I think perspective is very, very important on this. It takes the cops a long time sometimes to track down a bad guy. They still haven't found who killed Jimmy Hoffa or who shot JFK. Not to make light of it, but the idea is that solving a crime, tracking down one individual inside of a big city, particularly one who has a ethnic or kin group around him who's actively trying to protect him, takes some time. And the Belgian police did their work, and they tracked down the parachuter, and they'll track down, I'm sure, the people who did this thing yesterday. It's certainly not a matter of condoning terrorism in any way whatsoever. It's a matter of keeping a perspective on it and trying to avoid assisting the terrorists by triggering panic in our own society and triggering the crazy stuff that Republican candidates have been kicking out as possible solutions. If we think of it as a crime, we think of it as violence, I think there's perspective that is oftentimes otherwise very difficult to get a hold of.
Well, we talked about this last time. One second. We talked about this after the San Bernardino attacks. You said that we should police terrorism the way that we should police every other crime. But, in this instance, you have brothers who grew up together. In Paris, you had brothers and close friends who grew up together in this one neighborhood. And, they're not communicating out in the open. It's very difficult to infiltrate this. It's very difficult to, get a good grasp on what's happening when they're communicating the way they are. How do you police that?
Well, you police it the way that you can. We can point to, Igor, you and I live in New York City. There are people murdered here all the time. And any other big city. Sorry, it's called Latest. We're trying to keep up with the breaking. But I mean, there's people murdered all the time. There are bank robberies. There are drug deals. There are, crimes committed all the time. And it is, unfortunately, a part of modern life that crime goes on like this in some other big cities around the world. So, sure, we can't infiltrate every neighborhood. And, in fact, arguably, these things cause more trouble, more harm than they're worth. You've got to back up a few steps on all this and say, well, what causes people to become terrorists? What are the roots of these things? Why are these terror events, even though they're still kind of far apart, why are they more common now than they were at times in the past? If you can start to answer those questions, particularly focusing on the last 15 years since 9/11, you're starting then to talk about a more comprehensive solution that will work alongside of policing rather than simply playing whack-a-mole, which is basically the way we could sum up our anti-terrorism strategy to date.
Josh, did you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, and it's I'm glad you guys went ahead because this is what I was going to bring up. I mean, if you look back to say, starting with the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, and then, the terrorism task force of the FBI that was based in New York after that, headed by an agent by the name of John O'Neill, who tragically left the FBI in 2001 because they just weren't interested in prosecuting terror to the extent that, he thought they should be. And so he decided to go into the private sector as head of security for the World Trade Center. And he died in 9/11. But, before that, his whole career was about tracking, from the 1993 bombing, who was involved, where the materials came from, tracking the money, the USS Cole bombing and the embassy bombings, and what's impressive is how much work they were able to get done with no support of the FBI, top brass, which was, there were political things going on there, people vying for director and whatnot, and the fact that it wasn't seen as that grave of a concern. I mean, you have to remember that before 9/11, terrorism was a thing that happened over there. It didn't really happen here. And, when it does, we get our man and get them locked up. And it was in losing that strategy and after 9/11 becoming, making them part of this axis of evil and giving it this kind of supernatural power instead of it just being, thugs with guns and bombs who are decent at sneaking into places. I mean, they don't have special powers. They don't have, it's not some sort of magical, totally foreign ideology as it's, Islam compared to, say, other religions. It's just that because of the circumstances in which these people live, desperate people turn to religion for hope. And, the people in charge of these terror organizations and these terror cells are experts at taking that desperation and twisting it to murder and mayhem and crime and violence. And until we can recognize officially that sort of process happening, we're always going to be, talking about fucking or whatever shakes out. What do you think about this latest attack? The problem is that we're not talking seriously about it. The Republicans are thumping their chests, and Obama, he's been running near constant airstrikes, and he doesn't talk about it. So you have two sides of the coin there. One playing up the threat, and one perhaps arguably underselling the threat. And they need to start talking to the American people like they can handle it.
Well, just in terms of what you were talking about, us seeing it as happening over there, we still don't give a shit when similar attacks happen over there. I mean, just on Sunday, there was an attack in Ankara. It was a car bomb, killed over 30 people, injured over 100 people, got zero coverage compared to the wall-to-wall 2 days of Belgium coverage that we have right now. But, as far as what you were talking about with why people would turn to terror and what Peter was talking about with the increasing frequency of those, these neighborhoods were always like that. Why do you think now, Josh, it's happening more often? And do you think that Peter's comparison that we should police it just like any other crime is appropriate with how increasingly frequent it's becoming?
I think in terms of American response, it's absolutely appropriate. As far as what Belgium should do, one of the stories that I'm going to be writing for Latest.com today is a look at sort of what Belgium is like. And really, it's two separate countries. You have the northern area, where I believe they speak Dutch, and then you have the southern area where they speak French. And then in these sort of communities, there are these, the Muslim neighborhoods and the neighborhood of immigrants. But when the country is already in this sort of halved with a language barrier, that makes assimilating into a new area even more difficult. So why is it more troublesome now? I think because that's been allowed to continue in Belgium and across Europe and even here in America. There is a sort of, everyone's okay with the idea of Muslim migrants sort of setting themselves off from everyone else, which, to be fair, is their choice if that's what people want to do. But, in terms of talking about assimilation and things like that, there needs to be a more proactive effort to make it happen, to reach out to these folks. And I think part of the reason they're having, this scenario exists, and then here comes the so-called Islamic State that's very deft on the internet and very compelling with their social media and gives these people purpose and says, you come here and you fight. Not only will you exist as a person, you will be a holy warrior, and glory and honor and all this will befall you. And that, if you're desperate, that is appealing. People like to fight for a cause, especially if they're angry and they feel that they're being, sold short by the whatever they're angry at. So I think in ignoring these communities sort of foster, and now we're at a point where almost everyone's too scared to allow any real sort of outreach, which would take time to happen. Again, I think there's more hope over here than perhaps in Europe. But there's a very serious sort of problem that they have to deal with in terms of these communities, both in Belgium and elsewhere.
Josh mentioned the word anger several times there, and I think that's an important one to focus on, in that in order to begin to take apart this idea of terrorism, and that it is an idea, it's a concept, it's a set of beliefs, values, whatever, that are put into action. Let's look at it from someone else's perspective. The Middle East is now a war zone, and it's a war zone largely because of the United States and its coalition partners from Western Europe largely, who believe that it's a free fire zone. We learn now that we've got Marine artillery on the ground in Iraq. We have been conducting airstrikes all over the region, either overtly or through our nearly endless drone program. The CIA gets involved. We pick sides here and there. The one breath of hope that passed through the Middle East, the Arab Spring a couple of years ago, the United States didn't get behind it at all, and in fact allowed the military coup in Egypt to silence people, the governments, the kind of government that the people wanted, because it was Muslim. We didn't like it. When you see it from that perspective, when you hear from relatives that the town was bombed today, that the United States supports the Russians moving into Syria to combat ISIS. When you know from your own experience on the ground that the places that are being bombed are not ISIS, and that the people that the United States and Western Europe are claiming they're supporting are not really what's going on the ground. When you look at the hypocrisy of American actions, where we're supporting the Kurds, but we're supporting the Turks who are killing the Kurds, but we're supporting the Kurds who are killing the Turks, all in this belief that somehow it is our right, our privilege, and in fact, our responsibility to get involved in all these things. You really have a hard time not wondering why people aren't angrier. At the same time, you look at the rhetoric that's pouring out. Every time a preacher gets on YouTube and says, we're going to start a caliphate and we're going to take care of the infidels, we go complete batshit crazy. Every time a Republican candidate gets on TV and says we're going to nuke the Middle East till it glows, it's like, well, interesting comment, Wolf. I think, when we look at it in comparison, we talk about this, rationally. ISIS beheads someone and, we start an air campaign. Hillary Clinton, in her very weak denunciation of torture yesterday, said, well, we don't torture because it doesn't work. Those aren't really the kind of stirring words that you want to hear from a nation that insists that it remains exceptional. And if you're sitting in the Middle East, the most common American you're going to encounter is either a soldier or, by extension, a drone. 15 years of war in Afghanistan, continuing war in Iraq, the war spreading to Syria, the U.S. Saudi proxies fighting in Yemen, hospitals being blown up all over the place. You've just got to stop and wonder, maybe some of that drives that anger that says to someone, hey, I could be living in fairly comfortable material circumstances in Belgium, or I could blow myself up tomorrow. Well,
that leads us to a plan that Hillary Clinton released just before we started recording this, that she calls a real plan to defeat ISIS, which three steps. One, take out ISIS's stronghold in Iraq and Syria. 2, dismantle the global terror network. 3, harden our defenses at home and prevent attacks. Josh, how is this any different than Donald?
What's one again? What was that?
How is this plan any different than Donald Trump's very well thought through plan to knock the hell out of ISIS?
Because first of all, it's not the best because what Donald says is the best because he says it's the best. It's not. And I think the reason that all of these plans are shitty is because no one knows what the fuck to do. I mean, I think ironically, that's sort of the leadership response that would be the most honest to Americans, but also the one that they never, ever want to hear. To say that ISIS, we don't know what to do. There's no sort of coalition that can be formed because there's, for the people who live in these countries, the choice is, religious death cult or oppressive dictator regime. Who do you want to fight for? At least the death cult says life's going to be better after you're done living. There's paradise involved. The dictator, you might get a holiday after you win the war. So I think that, it's about presenting the illusion of strength and a plan, when in reality, we're probably not going to figure out the solution. The solution that will eventually take down, whether it's the Islamic State or if it morphs into a new version of, a jihadist terror group. Because to be honest, is the Islamic State is like the 4th or 5th generation of Al Qaeda. So, I mean, it's really all the same thing. They just changed their names and I don't think that there's a legitimate plan. There isn't a good plan out there now. And, again, the person who would say that wouldn't comfort a lot of people, but would earn my vote just for pure balls and honesty. And one more thing before I finish, just to sort of get to what Peter was saying. One thing I think that is interesting about sort of the Democratic leadership versus, say, Republican leadership. You have Clinton saying what she did about torture, how it doesn't work, which is a true thing, and probably something not working is the best reason to not go with a particular policy suggestion, regardless of what it is. Same with Obama, going to the baseball game. In principle, going through your life normally after terror is a good thing. But they aren't able to, Democrats it seems, get at that emotional business that like guys like Reagan could. Reagan, there was an article, I didn't actually dig into it, but apparently there was some sort of terror incident, and Reagan also went to a baseball game that same day. And the reason no one was talking about it is because he came out and said, well, and gave one of his speeches and made everyone kind of smile and feel like America was good. And that's sort of what the Democratic side is lacking. That's why, they might be smart and kind of wonky about it, and maybe even right. Who knows? But they don't make Americans feel that way. Whereas Republicans are almost surely completely fucking wrong. But God damn it if it doesn't sound like they're 1, passionate, and 2, gonna see it through to the ugly finish. And I think that's sort of where the argument for Americans needs to be adjusted. The Democrats need to start thinking about winning the idea argument and the emotional argument instead of just ceding that ground to Republicans who are able to then make cheap ploys at advocating for terror and torture and things like that.
It's a classic demagogue move. It's the go-to playbook, which is appeal to people's crudest emotions, and particularly when they're vulnerable, when they feel afraid. We have become, since 9/11, the most frightened country in the world. Americans live in a state of low-grade fear with occasional spikes when something happens, real or imagined. That's so shouldn't be us. I was going to say it's still not us, but in fact it is us. And demagogues play to that. They love it. It's all the fault of the Jews. It's all the fault of the Christians. It's all the fault of fill in the blank, because it's the same sentence that everyone's been muttering from time forward. And it's very, very sad that we have sort of devolved to that level. And it's also very sad that there are politicians who have gotten so skillful at manipulating us to the point where they're able to kind of twist and turn the concept of democracy itself on its head. Look, every jihadi that got picked up in Iraq had photos from Abu Ghraib on his cell phone. It was jihadi porn. They looked at it to get themselves pumped up. And the idea of torture working or not working is absolutely the wrong set of questions. The point is that when you say that torture might be justified if it could work, you are saying that torture is okay. You're telling the world that America will torture you if we thought it would do any goddamn good. At that point, you're telling folks, look, do you want to fight? These guys are going to torture you to death if they get a hold of you. So you better stand up and do something about that. We have got to become ourselves again. We're better people than what we've become. And if we ever want to have a chance of ameliorating terrorism, we've got to go backwards and look at ourselves before we became so goddamn frightened of everything.
Peter, I just actually had a thought while you were talking, because tell me it's not like what it was like to actually be in Iraq, right? Like, you're constantly hyper alert, watching every fucking thing, knowing something bad is going to happen. And then when something bad does happen, there's almost like this moment. Now, all right, the bad thing happened. Okay, I can exhale and now deal with the bad thing. It's like the whole fucking country has PTSD. I mean, exactly. And I don't say that to make light of either situation. I mean, It really is, because we're hyper. A story that I'm going to be writing for Latest.com today. It has to do with, Superman's big right now because of the movie, and there's this Supergirl show on TV. And I mean, there's never been a more American mythological symbol than fucking Superman, right? I mean, he black as his costume. But are about the American people. I mean, Superman came in the past, like from the 30s to the 60s to even the 80s. He came from Krypton and was a fucking American because he landed in Kansas and got adopted. Now, in both the TV shows and the movies, he's this scary immigrant. You don't know what he's capable of. We don't think we can trust him. I mean, that's how America has changed. Our myths are a reflection of us, and that is where we're at right now. Before Superman was the quintessential American because he was a refugee. He had nowhere to go, and he came to America to not only live free but help other people. And now he's just some other scary guy that we probably shouldn't trust because he's not, from fucking Wisconsin. It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad and a little scary.
The PTSD thing is quite good, because one of the unfortunate features of people who suffer from PTSD, of course, is hypervigilance. They can't shut it off. And you see that in soldiers who come back and they just can't relax. They can't sleep. They don't like to have their back to the door. It's that sense of it won't go away, and the same kind of level of high strungness, which was in many senses a survival mechanism in war, just doesn't work well if you're trying to have a reasonably pleasant society. But what happens is that instead of saying, gee, PTSD guy, here's some medication, here's meditation, here's some things you can do, our politicians are saying to our country, you must be even more alert. That's the standard phrase now. Maintain alertness. Be
you
aware
see something, say something.
Say something. The whole concept is that we are living on a battlefield, and someone on the bus with you could be a terrorist, and someone at the airport could be smuggling, titanium nuclear reactor aboard the plane or something like that. And it could be a child, it could be an old person, it could be that guy in the wheelchair, it could be any of us. And it creates an atmosphere that makes politicians like Trump almost inevitable. I mean, I would go as far as calling him, the first true post 9/11 candidate. And especially given how successful he's been. He plays to that fear. A lot of the media says, well, Trump stirs up anger. And I think they're getting at something, but I think they're wrong with that word. I think fear is what he actually is praying to.
Right.
It's not a particularly good picture.
Well, Hillary.
Well, and it's not just Trump.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say it's not just Trump. It's Ted Cruz too. Because don't forget that Ted Cruz came up with the idea of basically Muslim apartheid, in which Muslim neighborhoods have to be patrolled. On Bill O'Reilly last night, he said Bill O'Reilly asked him about bombing civilians, and he said no, of course we won't bomb civilians. He's like, but if we're not going to have rules of engagement that don't let us get what we need to get. So basically what he was saying was, get who we want to get. Basically he was saying that civilian casualties would no longer, be a deterrent to whether or not to launch an airstrike in a Cruz administration. And this is the guy who's supposed to be, better than Trump. I don't know. I don't know who do I want, the fucking torturer or the guy who wants to kill civilians?
But take Cruz's statement and put it in the mouth of an ISIS leader. Civilian casualties are just something we have to put up with if our goal is to, blow up the EU Parliament building or what have you. Collateral damage.
Mm-hmm.
Which means human beings splattered.
Well, with that said, we talked about it before more hypothetically that if another terrorist attack happens, then that guarantees Trump the nomination. I mean, maybe not in the U.S., but we don't have to talk about it hypothetically that much anymore because it seems like it's almost likely that another attack is going to happen. And with that said, Josh, would these terrorist attacks make Donald Trump an inevitable president no matter what Hillary does?
See, in the general, that's a tough question. Because again, in the primary, Cruz is just as crazy as Trump when it comes to their plans for the Middle East and dealing with terrorism. So I mean, they're both talking they're both appealing to that dark side nature of the voters. If it were, say, Hillary or Bernie, God bless his heart, trying to compete with Trump or Cruz on this front, I think it would guarantee the Republican victory unless Hillary or Bernie or fucking somebody could make that sort of emotional appeal in the way that Democrats aren't able to do. If you could get someone to come out there and do and I hate to keep bringing him up, but he was the best at this, a Reagan-like speech where he comes out and just sort of in the soft voice lays it out, makes you feel good, makes you feel safe, makes it feel like the adults are in. That, I think, is what we're desperate for. We are absolutely desperate for someone like that. And I think part of the reason why Trump is winning with, nonsense policy is that they just make supporters, it validates their anger and their fear and makes them feel like at least he understands it. If he can't fix it, he at least understands it. So I think that's, unless the Democrats can make that sort of same emotional argument, which is always harder when you're going for the higher emotions like, forgiveness and bravery instead of fear and anger. Another terrorist attack within our borders would mean President Trump or Cruz would be inaugurated in January.
Yeah, inside the borders, no question about it. But keep in mind, Hillary is the great chameleon of politics. We've watched her as soon as Bernie got any traction at all. Hillary, started morphing into Bernie and changing her positions on things and changing her literal tone of voice to become more Bernie-like. I suspect in the general election she will do exactly the same, but she will start to try to match Trump's levels of violence if polling shows that that's working. If it doesn't show it's working, she'll do something. She'll do something else. So I suspect if the attacks are overseas, where there's still a little fudge room, Hillary will change herself to keep the rhetoric at the same level. But I agree with Josh. I mean, God help us if there was any kind of large-scale terror attack in the United States. Trump might not be fascist enough for the American public at that point.
Yeah.
Well, just in terms of repercussions, so there's, you have the Middle East angle, and then you also have here at home, we're talking about encryption an awful lot these days, whether we're talking about how these terrorists in Belgium are communicating, or we're talking about the Apple versus FBI fight. And, Peter, you've been covering the Apple FBI thing, and we all support privacy, but certainly we all also support intelligence and terrorism efforts. How do we gather intelligence on terror networks if we can't access the communications of people we know are affiliated with jihadi groups?
Well, everything in a country that is an open country like ours involves trade-offs. If we were East Germany of the 1960s, we'd have a microphone in every home. We'd have everyone watching everyone else. There'd be cameras everywhere. We'd have as close to a 100% surveillance police state as it would be possible to do. And if new technologies, in East Germany's case, photocopiers and word processors emerge, we'd get rid of them so that no one could have any privacy, and we would have as close to 100% view of life as the government could get. But we don't live there, and I don't think we want to live there. And so there are always going to be trade-offs in an open society, and there are always going to have to be tolerance for things that we don't like. We have shades on our windows. We lower our voices. We say things to our spouses that we don't want our friends to hear, and vice versa. Privacy is very important in an open society, even if you lean out of the political sphere. If you start talking about having a marketplace of ideas, then privacy becomes absolutely essential, which is why it was written into the Constitution. So unless you want a police state akin to what we saw in some of the communist countries in the darkest times of the Cold War, you're not going to have a perfect system. You're going to have to allow the vast, I don't even know, 99 point how many 9% of us to have privacy, with the understanding that something might happen. Now, I want to quickly pile on top of that no one has made the claim that anything that's happened recently, terrorism-wise, has happened because of encryption. In other words, that if only something had been unencrypted, or then there wouldn't have been Paris or Brussels or San Bernardino. Nobody's, even the most ardent people inside NSA and FBI, have not made that case. Terrorists have used cell-based, not cell phone, but cell-based. I tell you something, you tell Josh something. In that way, if one of us gets caught, they can only trace the link back one or two steps. I mean, that's the way these things work. You work within ethnic groups, you work within religious groups, whatever. The surveillance stuff presumes that the bad guys are going to do all their planning using electronic means, which is false. It presumes that the rest of us don't deserve any privacy on the off chance that A, terrorist will use encryption, B, the government can't already break that encryption somehow, and C, that is the only sliver that stands between us and some form of Armageddon. And I would argue that those things it's going to be a pretty rare set of circumstances. Look, I want to go back to the idea of torture real quick, because, once upon a time, I was trying to get a scholarship, and we had this committee that interviewed me, and the question was, you're in a wartime situation, you have an enemy prisoner, if you torture him, you might be able to save your own soldiers' lives, what would you do? Now, in that kind of innocent time, the answer was you don't torture, that it's wrong. The things that go wrong after you do it far outweigh any benefit you might, emphasizing the word might. And that's the same thing with encryption. If we allow the government to know everything there is to know about us, the damage that will cause will far, far outweigh whatever possible good we think we might wring from that.
Well, I agree with everything Peter says. I think when you look at America as a whole, whether you go all the way back to the Patriot Act after 9/11 or the whole Apple FBI fight now, people in America, at least statistically, tend to side on the government's side. I think a lot of people are willing to give up privacy for this feigned notion of security. Josh, do you think that privacy can win out when most people don't even realize that they're, pushing to get rid of it?
I'm less optimistic than Peter. I actually think no. I think we would gladly surrender our privacy. In fact, I to be perfectly honest, there was a moment yesterday when I was, first looking into seeing what happened and watching the video clips that ended up being aired on a loop throughout the night. There was a moment where I said, you know what, take it. Take all my fucking metadata. Take it all. I don't want this to happen anymore. And again, that was just me having a moment of emotion, and I, did a shot of whiskey and went back to being a goddamn writer. But seriously, I do think that especially now with the way that we accept the terms and conditions on every fucking app we download, the way that we put everything on social media as it is, I really think there is this feeling in America that you don't really need that level of super encryption unless you've got some shit to hide. And, I feel like that's sort of part of the larger PTSD thing America is going through. I think that's something that, we're willing to give it up anyway, just to be able to have people to talk to and stuff to talk about on Facebook. I don't think that if effectively argued as being for not just our national security, the best interest of our national security, but the best interest of the world, people would give it up willingly. Ironically, though, encryption has nothing to do with what happened either in Paris or in Belgium. They were using burner phones, which aren't encrypted, but just basically throw away. Which that might be one of those things, actually, the metadata might have been good for. I don't get enough to make that call without more research. But I definitely know that encryption really isn't the problem or the solution. That's not what we should be talking about. I do believe that this is one of those times where, law enforcement is like, all right, we've got them. They're scared now. We can get this that we wouldn't be able to get, 6 months before when, people are, the encryption stuff people are worried about are like pictures of their dicks and stuff like that. So,
I like Josh's remark about, at the moment he saw those things and he said, I'll give it all away. I don't want, take everything, take all my privacy, if this stuff would stop. And that's a very normal, reasonable reaction at that point in time. The idea would be that if one of my family members was raped, and you said, wouldn't you like to have this gun and go shoot, the rapist down in the street? I'd say, of course I would. I want to do that. Give me the gun. I will go do that. But if I'm the mayor of the city and you're saying to me, do you want to unleash vigilante justice across the city? I have to say no, because my responsibility is bigger than myself. And so when people are saying, well, I'm going to throw away my privacy, well, good for you. Take the shades down. Stop, using passwords on your computer. Whatever. Put it all out there. Set up a 24-hour webcam in your bedroom. Whatever, go crazy. But that's up to you. Don't give mine away. And don't give away the future privacy of people, because that's what happens. When you open these doors, they don't close again. When you give government your information, you don't know where it goes. We do know, for example, that the NSA spying, which was pushed through after 9/11, supposedly to go after terrorists, was being shared over a long period of time under the table with the DEA. We now know it's being shared overtly with the FBI. We also know that this information exists. It's the internet. It's like the internet. It's forever.
Oh, and Peter, don't forget that they found that people were like looking up exes and looking up, spying on old girlfriends and rivals and stuff. Like, it was being abused almost immediately.
And so make the picture bigger. Look to the future and say, 10 years from now, do we really want to have thrown it all away? Do we really want to say to our kids and grandkids who may not even be born, you will not have any privacy because we were scared back in 2016 because we were convinced to jump at shadows. The country has mumbled through some difficult times over the last 220 years. We had the Nazis, we had the Japanese, we had the Cold War. We managed to stumble through all that, never mind all the other problems, and we didn't have to set fire to the Bill of Rights to do it. I'm not sure that a bunch of guys who live in ghettos in Europe or in the desert are really at such a threat level that we need to do it now. In fact, I'm certain we don't.
Well, I guess the erosion of policy is sort of like the homeland policy repercussion here as a result of terrorist attacks. And now, let's talk a little bit about the Middle East. Because one of the things that amused me about Hillary's plan to defeat ISIS was, what the fuck do you think we're already doing? I mean, there's nothing there that the government isn't already working on, no matter how haphazardly. But so just this week, we had a Marine killed in a rocket attack in Iraq. He's the second American killed in this totally not a ground war with boots on the ground operation. Peter, we knew the Pentagon was full of shit when they said that. How full of shit were they?
Well, I mean, it's pathetically full of shit, if that is a measure of full of shitness. The way the Pentagon, when they got caught, because this guy got killed, what they said is, well, Congress has allotted 3,852 troops to be in Iraq, and that's how many there really are permanently. And the idea was that the Marine unit was deployed offshore, on one of the assault ships, and they were only in Iraq temporarily. I mean, of course, as we all are, right? And so they didn't count against the head count. And so at this point, we really have no idea how many Americans are there. John McCain has estimated it as high as 5,000 uniformed people. And let's stop right there, because the uniformed people, the ones we actually recognize as soldiers and Marines, are just a part of what we've got there. We have probably 3,000 contractors in Iraq right now doing the support stuff, the maintenance, a lot of them doing guard duty, things like that. They tend not to be out in the wilds of Anbar. They tend to be back in Kurdistan, but there's a lot of them there. And then we don't even have a clue how many CIA people, paramilitaries, what have you. But if you start to add up the number of Americans who are there now who weren't there a year and a half ago, it's a big number. And it's a number that will only grow because what we're doing there doesn't have a conclusion. We will, in the end, have permanent bases in Iraq, the thing that we had talked about having and wanted to have for a long time and just never kind of happened. We're going to have those there. We're going to be garrisoning Iraq indefinitely at this point, as we are Afghanistan and everywhere else. We've been lied to. We've caught the government lying to us, and we simply do not care.
Josh, it really doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of difference between what Obama's doing now, what Hillary wants to do, and what George Bush did, except that Obama's doing it a lot more quietly. How do the liberals get away with the things that they accuse George Bush of war crimes over?
Well, again, I think it's partially because of sort of the narrative. One thing that, one hallmark of the Obama administration has not been deft handling of the press. That is not a strength that he has or a particular skill set I think the administration has in general. However, I think that, at least with this, they don't really push back on the Republican narrative that, President Obama is doing nothing to stop ISIS. They basically admit that they're doing something, but they don't give it a vigorous defense. And I think that's because, Democrats Democrats don't like to make a big deal about the war shit they do, whereas Republicans love nothing better than to be a war president. So I think that part of the reason that Obama is able to get away with it is because less numbers of troops. Now, and what I know about how military bases and operations work and what Iraq's like, I would think the number could be as high as 8,000 to 10,000 Americans, civilians and military in Iraq right now. I don't think that would be a stretch. But even that isn't what is the levels we were at, say, 6-7 years ago. And I think that's part of the reason why they're able to get away with it, because even though only 1%, actually less than 1% of the American population fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, served in the military over there, there was still, you couldn't really get away from the fact that we had people over there. And there were people in the news all the time dying. The news cared a lot more about what was happening in Iraq then. Today, all eyes are on Trump, and Obama's trying to kind of be boring so he can, get stuff, because he can get stuff done when no one's looking. And that's in part because of how controversial the Republicans have made anything he tries to do. So I think that has become, ironically, the preferred operating mode for the guy who promised to be the most transparent president in the history of the United States.
Keep in mind that George Bush was...
explain it.
Josh's video is getting caught up right now. Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry.
I think you're doing too excited, Josh. I think it overloads the internet.
It's the hat. It's the hat. They can't. There's not enough pixels for the hat's awesomeness.
But keep in mind, George Bush fought in Iraq for WMDs that didn't exist and regime change, and all these kind of things that aren't kind of liberal thinking. Obama's fighting against terrorism. He's picked up again, and we go back to the idea of fear. He's the one who's right. We're on the front lines. We're going after ISIS. They won't even call them ISIS, right? Because it's like, we're going to call them Daesh, and then they're going to really be pissed off because we're calling them a name. We're right on the front lines. We're fighting them out there, and so it seems okay. I mean, who can argue that killing ISIS is a bad thing? So I think it's partially the way we're manipulated and which lever the President Bush versus Obama versus whoever's next decides to pull. In the end, it's the same thing. And by the way, the 10,000 I think is a great number to play with right now. It wouldn't surprise me if it's a lot more.
I don't know if it came through when I was talking, but the one thing I said too, I think, is that unlike using troops, Obama's been able to do a lot with drones, which doesn't have that same sort of human cost for us. It's a great terrorist maker, especially in the wrong place. But I think that's another reason why, is because he's using robots, not America's kids.
All right. Well, that's probably as good a point to end this very depressing edition of Latest.com show on this week. And next week we'll come back and talk about something equally consequential, like the coming Donald Trump presidency. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for reading Latest.com. See you next week.